Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, back for now the third video of card reveals for the upcoming Legion expansion. It's only been a couple days since the last video was recorded, but we have now seen a total of 7 new cards revealed, and I think that is a good amount to do a discussion over. It seems like we're going to be getting many more this week, so I don't want to get too far behind, unlike last time where it got a bit ahead of me. So let's go right into it. So the first card we're going to take a look at is the 5th Parachute Brigade. It is a British standard rarity infantry, and it costs 0 credits, has 1, it operates for 1, and it is a 1/1 that has the keyword mobilize on it. So I think everybody instantly realizes that this is actually a really good mobilize card. Most notably, this card is incredibly powerful with the Potez 6311, which, for those that don't remember or don't know, it is a unit that whenever you play a mobilize unit, you draw a card and your HQ gains +2 defense. And we've seen that the Potez is very strong as an engine with the numerous cheap mobilizes. So having now a free mobilize means that those cards are going to, for free, cycle alongside the Potez. Really, the only limiting factor is your support line size, meaning you can only draw up to 3 cards with the Potez in a single turn. But that also means you're getting 6 health and putting out, 3 mobilize units. Alongside something such as the 73 or the 73rd Regiment, that is potentially a lot of health. This unit would gain a lot of stats, and overall that is just a really interesting card. Definitely works well with those two. There's also maybe a bit of synergy with the block MB152, which helps you to protect your units by making them not lose mobilize when damaged, which is an interesting, because these cards could potentially come down so quickly, could be decently big by the time the block hits the board, and then the enemy's not able to remove the smokescreen and they keep growing. But even outside of that, just having a 0 credit unit could potentially be an amazing card for more aggressive British strategies, which so far have not really panned out very well. But being able to put 2 or 3 of these on the board on turn 1 could potentially be a pretty overwhelming threat if the enemy's not able to remove them immediately. It's very realistic, I think, that if you play these on turn 1, that they will at least mobilize once, if not twice, before the enemy's able to deal damage to them. So I think the 5th Parachute is going to almost certainly make its way into the British-French mobilize deck, but I'm also curious if maybe some sort of aggressive British deck comes around without relying just on the mobilize and using this just for very cheap, aggressive, swarming threats. Next up, we have a Polish card this time, the 7TP. It is a special tank. It costs 2 credits and operates for 1 credit. It is a 2/3, and it has the text, when this unit survives combat, draw a card. So we have seen this effect one time before with the IL2MPL, which we talked about last time. So surviving combat, to refresh everybody's memory, is when this unit fights another unit and survives. It does not count when it's attacking HQ, and it does not matter who attacks. It doesn't matter who even deals damage. It just matters that this unit was involved in combat with another unit. So going to the 7TP, I think this is actually a fantastic card. We have seen that decently static cards that draw cards is often quite an effective tool. It reminds me actually a lot of the Japanese 33rd Recon, which is a 1/2 that when it takes damage draws a card. Usually you're only going to get 1 card out of this, but I think that is still quite impactful. And I think the 7TP reaches a similar level to them, being able to gain you one card before dying off. But this card also benefits from being, a tank, and also probably being a good buff target, with stuff like the US buffs. Like, some examples include things like the USAS, or something like supply chain, wherever that is, or supply shipment, my bad. You could potentially have a really strong unit that sticks around and every turn is drawing you an extra card, all nicely bundled in a decently statted 2-drop. I don't know, we'll have to see if this inspires any archetypes, but I do think that this card is really, really just solid. It's like a rock solid card, and if you're going to be playing with Poland, I think this card is always going to be one of those things you consider to include in the deck. So that's really interesting. Based on how we've seen the IL-2, the 7TP, and another card we're going to talk about, it seems like the Survive Combat is going to be a theme. So we'll have to see if there's any other cards that are like that, and whether or not this can all come together into maybe some sort of actual archetype to build around. Overall, a really good card. And speaking of good cards, let's talk about Partisans. So the Partisans is a 6-credit Soviet special rarity order, and it has the text, take control of an enemy unit. At the end of turn, send it to the enemy's hand. Or send it to owner's hand, my apologies. So we've seen with Breakthrough, there were a couple of these effects that came around. Most notably, Confusion, which was able to take control of any enemy unit that cost 3 or less until end of turn. And then they just got it back if you didn't do anything with it. But that proved to be quite impactful, or quite useful in the right matchup, where you're able to steal an enemy unit, use it to attack another enemy unit, and then do something like Ural Factory or Red Banner on it in order to get a high, in order to, keep the unit, allowing you to effectively 2-for-1 and put your own unit out on the board. Although you didn't have much control, it was still potentially quite a strong tempo swing. Partisans falls, I think, very similar into that category. Being able to steal any unit, you could essentially see this as a 7-credit to play your own unit and then destroy an enemy unit. So you just steal an enemy unit and then play Ural Factory or Red Banner on the stolen unit, and you've killed theirs and put your own thing out. That is quite useful and actually fits quite closely with some of the other cards around this price range. Things like the 83rd Naval Brigade. I think the big thing to note about Partisans is that it is potentially very random in what you get. You don't have much control over what the enemy plays, and most nations aren't as consistent as like the Soviets are with their price range. Probably, I think the first example we're going to all think of is actually stealing a B-17, attacking with it, and then playing Ural on it in order to get either the new B-17F or the Pershing, which is definitely a highlight and would definitely be probably really powerful against other ramp decks. But I think it's very important to note that not every strategy, or not every deck or nation even, has such similar consistency. A lot of nations have a lot of duds. For example, Britain, if we look at their high-cost cards, there's definitely some nice stuff here, but you also have some real, stinkers, like the number 43 Commandos or the Mosquito or stuff like that. And even at 7 credits, some of this stuff is at best average, but not anything particularly strong. So I think Partisans is actually going to compete real closely with stuff like 6 Airborne and the Siberian Transfer, which I think produce actually really similar effects. Partisan is potentially more powerful against the right decks. But I would say stuff like Siberian Transfer and the Airborne are more consistent. Always being able to upgrade a Soviet 5-drop in the T-34 into a 6 or 7-drop for the Soviets has been very powerful and a big board swing. And you still get to do 5 damage if you operate the T-34. So it actually comes out, I think, very close. So I'm interested to see if Partisans can make its way into a value list. You know, if the meta values like ramp and other things, or decks that are running a lot of high value targets that are consistent when you like Ural them, I think that Partisans will be an instant include. But otherwise, I'm actually not sure if it will be able to find room. Soviet Value's got a lot of things going on with it, and there's a lot of really good cards that are wanting to make their way into the deck. It's by no means a bad card. I just don't know if it's if the meta is going to accept this. At least for right now, I actually don't think this card is particularly strong. Soviet Value's not played that much, and the meta decks like British Control or the various aggro decks really don't have anything worth stealing, or this card is so expensive that you really don't want to be using it over something like Confusion. But if the meta turns towards a more value point, I think this will definitely be a very strong consideration. Next up, we have a British order, which is Emergency Measures. It is a standard order, and it costs 1 credit and says, choose and discard a Spitfire to deal 4 damage to target unit and pin it. So that is obviously a Spitfire card. And we've seen that Spitfire decks have slowly been getting some strong support, steadily be getting support with more Spitfires being added and various support tools. We have that new Polish Spitfire, which I would argue is a better 6-credit Spitfire than some of the other options. Oop, wrong card, apologies. There we go. The Spitfire is, but a big thing with the Spitfire deck was actually their kind of passive early turns. Spitfires often clogged your hand with these 5-credit and 4-credit and 6-credit cards that you're kind of wanting to wait until you can play this slow turn 3 card and then play them out the next turn. It's a very slow strategy, potentially quite powerful when you play it, but also probably quite it struggled a lot in enabling certain archetype, or enabling the archetype. Britain doesn't have a lot of cheap ways to deal damage. If we look, they really only got ways to like pin with Monty and naval power, or something like the Desert Rats. So potentially having 1 credit destroy an early drop is potentially quite useful. 4 damage is enough to deal with almost every early game unit. You're able to deal with even like buffed up like Panzer IIAs and stuff like 4 health stuff, which has gotten buffed, which is something that not many cheap removal orders can do. It's definitely not something I think you should run 4 copies of, but I think in the Spitfire deck there's definitely room for it. It helps you to smooth out the early game, but usually if you're playing the early game, like if you're playing against aggro, those Spitfires aren't going to be doing much for you. A 6-credit Spitfire probably won't help you against aggro, so being able to just ditch it in favor of being able to blow up that 4 health unit that they spent a turn buffing is very strong. And this even remains useful in the late game because it pins, meaning that you could potentially, pin that big enemy bomber or big tank, deal 4 damage to it, and then next turn do something like carpet bombing, or just smack it with your own Spitfires. So I think this is definitely a good inclusion in the Spitfire deck, and it'll probably find at least a couple slots in there, simply because it's, a tool that you don't have to rely on your ally to do anymore. You're not going to rely on, say, Japan or on something like the US or the Soviets to have, cheap interaction with enemy aggro tools. So I think that is definitely a strong consideration. And elsewhere outside of Spitfire, we're not going to see this. Unless you're running Spitfires, this card is literally 1 credit, do nothing. So we won't see it outside of Spitfire. But in Spitfire, I think it's a good inclusion. Moving on to the cards today, we have Shock Attack. This is a Japanese standard rarity order, costs 1 credit, and it has the text, when a friendly unit loses smokescreen this turn, it gains +2/+2. So this definitely raised a lot of interesting discussion because it is potentially a lot of stats for very cheap. Being able to give your units +2/+2 is quite the powerful effect, and it could really do some damage if you find a good amount of smokescreen units to combo with it. Now, in terms of Japan itself, they are actually really small on smokescreen units. This is all they have, 4 units, of which 2 of them really are pretty meh. One of them has a 4 operation cost, and the other one is Sendai. And Sendai is good, but you wouldn't want to build a deck around trying to buff Sendai. That's not a good idea. If we look in the other nations, it gets a little better. The US has some smoke screens with their various Marines and the combat engineers. Soviets have some good options. The 37mm AA gun or the 4th Cuban Cossacks are both good options. Britain also maybe has it. It has a handful of commandos and airborne units that have smokescreen, and they're quite cheap. So, that's maybe an option. And then probably the one that everybody thought about, the Germany with the Panzer IIA and Stug 3F, 2 high health and cheap tanks that have smokescreen. And I think this is definitely where smokescreen is most likely to fit into, as a buff for some sort of smokescreen tank aggro deck. However, I don't know if that is going to be that strong. The big reason is that you have to keep the units in smokescreen until you play Shock Attack, which means that you're going to be spending turns playing units out, but then not doing anything with them until you play, enough out to where you want to play then Shock Attack, and then you have to move and operate all of them in order to get the buffs. That's a lot of work, and it's, the passivity of those early turns trying to set this up makes me hesitant to say if this is actually super strong. I think it's definitely in the right scenario very strong, but I also could see I see an argument that why not just play like the standard German US aggro deck, which can accomplish similar boards with stuff like Fast Heinz or with the Panzer IIIF, while also getting to play those units and then move and operate them in the early turns. Like if we take, for example, I would say probably one of the best starts with Shock Attack we can do. Turn 1, we play a Panzer II. Then turn 2, we play a Stug 3F. And then turn 3, we play Shock Attack. And then move the Panzer II and the Stug into the front line. That gives us a 3-5 and a 4-5 tank on turn 3. But we're not able to attack with them. So that means on turn 4, we can then attack with those 2. And then we'll have 2 credits left over to play whatever else. That actually doesn't sound that strong. These obviously have a lot of health, but turn 3 and turn 4 are when these big guards start coming out. Italy is, like the British control decks are playing Bologna Regiment on turn 3 and are playing stuff like Seaforth Regiment on turn 4. And we only have 2, units with 5 health. Sure, they might be able to bring it down, but they're only going to be on a couple health points after that. So Shock Attack, it's a card that I think we'll have to see in action to truly judge, but I don't think it's actually going to become any meta defining. I think German US aggro tanks are going to be the more popular, but I think this will spawn at least an offshoot of that deck running more smokescreen oriented stuff. But I don't know if that's going to really overtake the other lists. Following in line with Shock Attack, we have its partner in crime, the P1Y2 Kasho. It is a special rarity bomber. It is 5 credits and operates for 2 credits. It is a 2/3 with smokescreen and the same text of when a friendly unit loses smokescreen, it gets +2/+2. This is essentially just having smokescreen or having Shock Attack on a unit. It is important to note that this unit will buff itself when it attacks, so it is a 4/5 bomber if it survives for that turn. But the high cost is definitely a big problem with the card. You have to play it out and kind of hope it survives, because then you probably next turn play it. I think this is trying to push the smokescreen deck in some sort of like to mid-range capacity, but it's hard to say if the Kasho is really going to stick around that much. It does have smokescreen, so it's not going to get killed by units, but there's a lot of orders that are able to just deal 3 damage or just kill it outright. So I have a bit of a problem seeing the Kasho making it into a deck. Maybe the smokescreen deck is willing to go into the mid game and willing to take a slow turn to get the Kasho down just so it can have more buffs. Because it is true that if you have like a Kasho out and then like do something like Shock Tactics and then like move a Panzer II and break its smokescreen, that is a 5/7 tank with Blitz for operating for 1 credit with 1 turn. That is potentially very powerful. And you can do that with multiple of them. So there's definitely the powerful effect of it stacking on top of each other. But again, we'll kind of have to see. I think that'll have to be like even a more different deck than like the Shock Attack tank aggro deck that I was talking about previously. And this would be some sort of more mid-range deck, looking to play the early game kind of normal and then have power turns in the mid game. I don't know if that's going to work out though. But moving on, we have the final card for this video, which is the Zaza Division. It is a Polish card, the next one we've seen. It is a special infantry, and it is a 4 credit that operates for 1 credit. It is a 2/5, and then it has Blitz, Fury, and the text, when a friendly unit survives combat, give it +1 attack. So this is a board-wide buff when you attack with it. I think that the first idea I had was combining it with any amount of artillery. Many decks have artillery, and being able to attack with them, kill something, and buff it up is quite powerful. Stuff like these T-19 howitzers or the various Soviet artilleries. You can use them to kill an enemy unit, because that is combat. If an artillery attacks another unit, that is combat. And I think that makes the Zaza Division, potentially a strong mid-range threat in certain decks. For the body itself, it does have Blitz, which does make it nice to apply pressure on its own. And it has a lot of damage stored up in it. That Fury can really get going when it's buffing itself, because it does buff itself with that attack bonus. So it's able to, or you can even just use it to help like trade down 2 threats and then, have it stick around on a couple health points buffing your various other units. Also with bombers, it's quite good. If we're talking about with the 70P, which was another card that has the survive combat, I think the Zaza's probably decent enough to fit into that deck, but it's hard to say. I think it definitely has its strongest roots in a deck that has a lot of artillery or bombers in it, as those units can get the free attack buff without taking damage. And in a fight deck, so far, we really only have the 7TP, so it's hard to say if a full-on, like, I'm going to fight you deck, but there is also the potential that that deck is going to be running a lot of buffs, which makes the Fury on Zaza Division even more scary. You slap it up with a couple cheap buffs, and this could potentially be smacking the enemy for 8-10 damage a turn very quickly. And if it is forced to fight, or if the enemy attacks into it, it just grows itself. So I think this is definitely a very interesting card. We're going to have to see where it ends up, and where this entire fight theme seems to be going, as I think there's a lot of room for it to be expanded upon, and it'll just really depend on how many more of these survive combat cards are we going to see. Can we actually fill out the Polish ally with them, or is this going to be it, and this is more of a niche thing you put in the right deck rather than build a deck around? That is just something we'll have to see in the coming days. But beyond that, that was our final card. So I want to thank you all for listening to this video. Definitely some interesting cards. The Japanese smokescreen was not something I was expecting to really get support, and I personally do love the survives combat. That's going to encourage people to be fighting and trading with their various units, and if you can keep those units alive, if you build your deck right and keep them alive, they could pay off massively, growing in attack and drawing cards and all sorts of whatever else effects that happen with it. So I want to thank you all for listening to this video or watching it. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It seriously helps me out and benefits me a ton. We're still growing the channel. Part 3 of the German budget lists should probably be coming later this week. And I'll probably be doing another one of these reveal videos in just a few days, based on how often we're getting reveals. It seems like 3 a day, and I feel like 7 or so cards is the right amount. So beyond that, I think that's it. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a good day.